Today on the MindTreeX Exponential podcast, we're going to learn about enrichment. Through the amazing process of enrichment, we can use audiobooks to teach children literacy. In most places, literacy is overlooked in favor of reading. Using audiobooks, we expand beyond the tiny subskill of decoding text into the greater, higher cognitive functions involved in true literacy. Also, with audiobooks, the speed of information is increased, and therefore the flow of information and the experience of the story. This is what makes reading great. This is what makes literacy even better. And in that flow, students can pick up other skills that will actually help them decode text later, such as inferential vocabulary acquisition. Finally, and most importantly, through the use of audiobooks, you can teach your child to love literature, love reading, love experiencing language. And that is something amazing you can share together. For MindTree Exponential, enrichment is most readily understood through the process of learning to read. And that's actually a term that a public school would use, learning to read. Reading is always the most important thing. However, if you have a child with a learning disability, for example, dyslexia, which makes it disproportionately difficult for a child to decode text and therefore to read, this emphasis on reading becomes very oppressive and leads to being placed in struggling reading groups where other struggling readers all sit together and they all struggle to read together, and it's very miserable. It's a very unpleasant label to be given, that you're a struggling reader. It implies that you're not smart. And so when my daughter comes home from school and she's struggling and I have to go in and speak with them about her learning disabilities, and I notice that all they do when they read is decode text, a process that has not changed. So everywhere else in my daughter's life, there's technology. There's 21st century technology everywhere, except when she's learning to read, which is supposed to be one of the most important things she's doing, and they don't include any tech in it. So, luckily, now that we're homeschoolers, we decided to change that. And specifically, we decided to look at what is it that good readers do? How do people that actually enjoy reading come to enjoy reading? And specifically, I enjoy reading, although I too find it very difficult to decode text. That has to do with my vision. It's something with an astigmatism in one eye and nearsighted, farsighted. Anyway, text is very jumbly on the page for me, and I find it very discomforting to try and read. Luckily, there's something called audiobooks, an amazing technology. But the number one response I get anytime I mention audiobooks in a context of reading, so someone will say, "Oh, have you read this book?" And I say, "Oh, well, I listened to the audiobook." I get a look, and they're looking at me like, "Oh, well, you haven't actually read the book, though." As if it were different somehow. And they're right. It is different, actually. When I'm listening to an audiobook, instead of wasting any mental energy decoding text, I'm spending all of my mental energy thinking about what the book is about, the content. Now, so when my daughter came home and she was a struggling reader in public school, and they were trying to work on phonics and slowing the reading down every day by breaking it smaller and smaller pieces, removing all the meaning. Well, we got rid of all that and decided to use audiobooks. And more specifically, the one joy that my daughter had from school reading was that the teacher one time had read a book to the class and she really enjoyed it. And it was by John R. Erickson. And it's a serial book series with Hank the Cowdog, it's called. And it just so happens that Mr. Erickson narrates the series himself using great voices and very, very well narrated book. Well, she wanted to hear the rest of the story. She never got to hear the rest of the story in class. And so we go to the library and we check out the audiobook version. 2 discs. And we go and we set her up in her room and she gets to listen to it. And she's done in no time. And next thing I know, she comes back. And she's like, I'd like the next one. And I explained to her to go on to the library and here's how you can put it on hold. And so she goes in and she puts some of these audiobooks on hold. And the next day, the next 2 days, we go to the library and there's 50 audiobooks on hold. The whole John Erickson series, the whole Hank the Cowdog series on hold. And, well, I check them out and she buzzes through them. Just mows them down. And before you know it, she's listening. And as she's pacing in her room and she's listening to the story and laughing and enjoying the story and the drama, understanding what the story was, she finally gets why listening, why reading might even be enjoyable. She's like, oh man, this is great. And she goes back online and puts on hold the textbook, the actual hard copy book. And she picks that up and she'll thumb that occasionally while she's just hanging out. She'll look at the pictures. And she listens to all these stories. 50 stories. As compared to one, not even a whole one in class, in school. And very quickly, by using audiobooks, she develops what's most important for learning how to read, which is a love of literature, a love of literacy. And that is the big difference. There's a huge difference between reading, learning how to read, and learning how to be literate. Literacy is such a grander concept that contains the very small subskill called reading. Reading is a very, very small part of the much greater concept of literacy, the much greater human ability called literacy. And enrichment shows that text is the least rich way for a brain to connect with content. It's text. It's very simplified. Now, if you add sound to that, that's richer in experience. You can add a picture to that, which is why my daughter wanted to get the book. So she had the sound, the text, and a picture. Those are 3 different ways of receiving input. Sensory stimulation, it's richer. And that allows her brain to create a richer environment of the content that she's hearing, a richer image in her mind. And that's enrichment. And audiobooks are richer. than regular books. And some people don't like that. They don't like when I switch the tables on them, and instead of them giving me the look like, oh, you only listen to the audiobook, so you haven't actually read the book, I give them the back. I say, oh, you only read it. You didn't actually listen to the audiobook. So, And for specific audiobooks, like the John R. Erickson is a great example. He wrote the book, and you can read it, but you can get a richer, fuller experience if you go and listen to the author read the book, because he can add the right emphasis, the right emotion, the right jokes. He can put even more meaning to the text by reading it. And that goes to the statement that a lot of our communication is done non-verbally. There's a lot of communication in a voice, especially when that voice is very funny. And John Erickson has the best voices. But audiobooks don't teach a kid to read. That's the problem. So get out of here. This is all nonsense. Enrichment, get out of here. But with the mind spending all this time on the content, using these very high-level critical thinking skills, they grow. And the ability to infer vocabulary, for example, where you fill in the meaning of the word by understanding the text, the context around the word. It's called Inferential Vocabulary acquisition. And listening to audiobooks is an amazing way to develop the skill to do that. And that skill transfers. So if you can do it while you're listening to an audiobook, you can later go and read a text and decode that text more effectively because of your familiarity with the patterns of language and the words that are likely to come next in the reading. So it turns out that, among many other things, one of the best aspects of audiobooks is the ability to infer the meaning of vocabulary through the context of the book. That's one of the skills that enrichment of text through the use of audiobooks provides. An inferential vocabulary acquisition is a much greater skill when considering literacy versus reading. While it's important for reading, of course, decoding unfamiliar words is far less useful than being able to understand what those unfamiliar words mean. However, what happens next is most important. Using the technique of enrichment to improve the learning of literacy led next to an intrinsic motivational drive to find literature of more depth. So, having enriched simple text allowed my daughter to learn about literacy. And once those high-level skills, those high-level literacy skills start to grow, and they're really powerful, and they want more. And they want deeper, more complex stories. And thankfully, you can get audiobooks and present material that she could not read on her own, probably. It's too dense. But thanks to an audiobook taking care of the decoding and the decoding of unfamiliar words that are hard to pronounce or are spelled irregular, and she can use inferential vocabulary skills to understand their meaning, whereas if she had been spending her time decoding it, she would have lost the whole story, and it would have been hard to even understand what the word meant, even if she had been able to decode it and pronunciate it correctly. It would have had no meaning. But the most important thing is that she wanted to engage with more stories, where before she hated reading, as most kids do, because it's so slow and boring and lacking. And what that causes is word poverty, a form of poverty where kids aren't exposed to language and they don't like it and they don't want to be exposed to it. But audiobooks changes that, and it allows them to enjoy stories, and they want to be around language and words and literature, and just being around it increases the odds that they will engage with it. And over time, it's a self-reinforcing cycle of greater literacy. So, you take the audiobook, the text, regular textbook, and the books have pictures. That's great. But here's the final enrichment for this episode, and this is the best reward. So having listened to the audiobook, followed along in the text book of it, looked at all the pictures, having understood the vocabulary, some of the new words they were exposed to, and maybe engaged in a discussion with you, the parent, about the book, you guys can sit and watch the movie together as a reward. And you can't do that with Hank the Cowdog, but there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Harry Potter is a great example. You have the book, the audiobook, which is read by a great narrator, and then of course the movie series, and it's just a very enriched experience. And of course there's a world you can go to and actually walk through, so that's even a greater enrichment. So, enrichment and learning to read. Reading text, especially for students who have difficulty decoding text, takes reading and turns it into a very slow and boring activity and removes all the enjoyment. The story stops flowing. There's no story. There's no flow of a story. Audiobooks bring that flow back. They put speed through the introduction of technology, which just a recording device doesn't seem like a lot of tech, but it's an amazing piece of tech. And it increases the speed of the flow of information, which allows the child to experience the story. And oftentimes, it allows the child to experience the comedy of the story as well. And that creates an enjoyment. And enjoyment drives the desire to have more stories. And as you listen to these stories, or as the child listens to these stories, their ability to understand and use high-level critical thinking skills grows. And that creates a drive and a desire to have deeper, more complex books. And this is the process and the growth of literacy. And these skills, which come through the listening, the act of listening, are transferable to help a child eventually if they need to decode text. They support the ability to decode text. But more importantly, they allow the child to understand what it means to love a story and love the flow of information. And the reward for having listened to the audiobook and looked over the text and looked at the pictures is that it gets deep into their brain. These ideas, these concepts that were presented in the story, they get in there and they stick, and the brain is thinking about them. And as a parent, you get the reward of sitting down and watching a movie with them. And oftentimes the movie and the book are different. And this will engage the student or the learner or the reader in discussion. And that's even greater way of that's an even greater way of engaging with the content and ensuring that the content of the story, the content of the text that you were intending to read, the ideas, the concepts, the meaning of the text is engaged with. And that's the real power of literacy, of reading. The idea behind reading isn't the actual decoding. There's no value in decoding text. The value comes from the meaning of understanding what the text contains. And audiobooks bump up the process and actually increase the value of time spent. So we can go back to the number one response that I get when I talk about audiobooks, and that is that response people give me that, oh, well, you haven't actually read the book. And through understanding the concept of enrichment, we can see that audiobooks aren't as good as reading the book. In many, many ways, very few of which I've discussed even now, audiobooks are exponentially better for the development of literacy, which is itself exponentially greater than the small subskill of reading. So go with your kid, go to the library, pick up an audiobook. It takes a little getting used to, but very quickly it can become the most rewarding habit for learning in the 21st century. For processing the amount of information that we have to process, that comes across our desk every day in the 21st century. Audiobooks help us process information very efficiently, and they increase literacy. They're amazing. Go get yourself an audiobook, although you're already listening to this, so I suppose you're already on the right track. Thanks for listening to this Enriched podcast. If you got some value here today, please leave a comment. Adding your 2 cents to the bank of discussions on these important topics enriches us all.